not really where we want to go, then I can change that and we can just discuss it more informally. Mainly I wanted to do an experiential workshop to describe and explain and give you the opportunity to experience the way I work with stories with people generally, but I think it's particularly useful with hard to reach young people. I've written here just some key words that I think it takes in a lot of different disciplines and lots of different areas of knowledge. So I've just written up some key words, and if anybody wants me to go into any of that in more detail, then please ask. Attachment. I think the people that I work with in the pupil referral units have quite dysfunctional attachment. I don't know if that's something that makes sense to... I'm assuming most of you are teachers. Is that correct? Or what kind of background do you all come from? That would be a good starting point. Would you like to start? Neuroscience, great. Neuropsychology I have written up here as well. I think it looks at left brain and right brain processing. Anybody else?
Oh, I have been working with children with behavioral problems.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So there, this comes to this bit here, the emotional expression versus behavioural management. I think it's quite important to facilitate emotional expression, whereas when I go into the PRUs, the pupil referral units, for anybody who doesn't know, they're the units that we have for the children who can't be contained, can't be managed in mainstream school, so they are excluded. And sometimes the children are then excluded from the pupil referral units with nowhere to go. And I think I had in mind the research, and then once I started the research and went in, I thought, yes, definitely, there needs to be more opportunity for emotional expression and not just the behavioural management. The behavioural management was done by really caring people, but I still think, it needs that opportunity for emotional expression. Can I carry on asking what you think of?
So psychology and engineering, actually.
Okay.
not teaching.
Right. Well, psychology, attachment theory, neuropsychology. Reflection is a term that is particularly used in terms of counselling. It's also about the parenting. When a child develops their sense of self through the mirroring of the primary caregiver, and I think that's important in the way that you work with these children, that you're reflecting back where they're at rather than being too intrusive. Okay, engineering, I don't think I go into that area at all.
I'm a teacher, but I'm also working as an educational researcher with literacy and how stories, and particularly the kind of distancing use of a story, allows students to explore their own kind of identity without actually foregrounding that they're talking about themselves.
Yes, yeah. So that's very much why I like this way, because it's an indirect medium. It's a psychological term that we use is that it allows them to project or talk about it symbolically. Yeah, so I'll talk about that.
I work with policymakers and teachers on various assessment practices in the classrooms. And before that, I was a music teacher.
All right.
So I'm quite interested in this creative art aspects of therapy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I was a teacher of English as a foreign language. Work with adults, young learners, teenagers. But for my PhD research, I worked with women. And I use stories in the sense that I use life history research. So it is in a way trying to make sense of what brought them to literacy, again, courses. Trying understand that through the stories about their lives that they tell.
Well, so that's something that when I tell a story, and I'll go through it in more detail, when I tell a story, they have the opportunity to have a whole variety of creative responses to the story, and it could be music, it could be anything at all. But one thing that typically some of them do is to talk about their own life story, and ideally for these kind of children, that's a very useful process for them to go through.
I am looking at histories of home educating families. So I'm interested in the story and sort of the life story, as you're saying, as a research tool, but substantively looking at home educating families. I've seen a movement in the last 10 years, particularly with children that have been excluded from school, parents turning to home education as an option and actually being suggested to go that way by schools and local authority.
That's interesting. I don't really cover that area in this workshop, but I'm a mum of 3, and I've home educated all of my 3 up until the age of 7, 9 and 13. At those ages they all decided to go back into school, or to go into school for the first time.
We should talk after this.
Yes. So are there any terms here that anybody would like me to explain before I carry on?
I wasn't sure what SEAL stood for.
SEAL, social and emotional. Let's see. It's not actually what I do. SEAL is the emotional literacy component that schools practice here. So a lot of people who are in education understand that. Social, emotional,
Affect?
don't know. No, I don't. I can't remember because I actually, although I started with that idea, thinking that I was going to do a kind of SEAL research, I then just sort of steered away from this. So, but it's the emotional literacy component that kind of comes down from the government.
Can you know what the PRUs mean?
Sorry?
The PRUs.
Pupil referral units. They are the units that the children or young people go to when they're excluded from mainstream school. And some say they're excluded because the school can't manage them and it's to protect the children who are in school. And some say it's to offer them a different learning environment. Okay. So I'll move on to do the presentation. So please feel free to ask any questions as I go through. So the plan is that I'll talk about the research for about half an hour. Do people want to know about the research, or do we just want to go into the experiential part? The research?
Research, yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Then I'll tell you a story, short story. So I will give that story to you to process in whatever way. And the objectives would be hopefully to develop the skills to engage young people with stories, or to engage anybody with stories, to develop an appreciation of stories and how stories might be used, to develop an appreciation of ourselves, because the experiential part will be a kind of personal development opportunity, and to develop an understanding of heuristic research. Nobody's mentioned that. Is that an element that people are interested in, or not? Because I don't want to spend time on anything that's not where people want to go. So the power of stories. If anybody wants references, I will give my thesis reference list to Mahini and Charlotte. Yes. But also tacked on, and that's obviously the typical way of referencing, but tacked onto the end of that are some storytellers that I could introduce you to. There are lots of stories are used in education. Education psychologists have a particular approach. Not all of them fall into that category, but there is a particular approach, kind of cognitive behavioural approach. My approach comes from traditional storytelling and a Steiner approach. So hopefully you'll understand the difference as I go through. So stories are a transformative force in people's lives, provoking self-reflection and change, and are profoundly human. We can recognise ourselves in a story and celebrate what we human beings are capable of and what it is to be human, and to reveal to us our shared strengths and weaknesses and dreams and passions and terrors and absurdities. Isn't the very point of story, the value, the heart of story, to do just this? And the idea is, of course, that stories have been used across cultures and across centuries, and therefore they seem to have a value, they have a use. So I'd like to just promote the idea of it. So here's a list. I mean, there are just so many different uses of stories, or this list could be very, very long indeed. But here I've just noted. Stories have been used for centuries across cultures to facilitate an understanding of the world around us, to provide a stimulus for discussion about life's dilemmas, offer an opportunity to safely and vicariously experience painful emotions. So that comes back to the idea of projecting them and experiencing them at a distance. And people do that with soap operas and all those kind of things. We're doing it all the time, aren't we? And we might not be aware that we are processing those emotions. They allow the opportunity to examine alternative psychological or philosophical perspectives, build an emotional vocabulary and develop emotional awareness, encourage empathy, exploring the different perspectives of the characters within the story, encourage personal integrity, letting go of the past, focus on personal resourcefulness and hope, and offer an opportunity for a reparative relationship. That's one of the big things that I'm interested to get across today, is that reparative relationship. So I come from a background in clinical psychology and counselling psychology, and there we talk about what's therapy about, and there's a big argument that therapy is about the reparative relationship, and I think that relationship, that experience can go across all different areas. So for teachers, for parents, for just people, for carers, just in the way we relate to people, we can be promoting a reparative relationship. And I think stories offer a very good opportunity for that. Would anything like me to expand on that, or is that okay? Yeah. So, all the peoples that I've worked with have engaged with stories. So as a community practitioner, I was a psychologist, and then I started to, when I had my children and I was home educating, I started to go into schools and do storytelling work as a community practitioner. And that would be working on transition projects, self-esteem, things like that. And the teachers would say, no, this person isn't appropriate, no, that person isn't appropriate, and they would exclude certain people from the class. And I would say, well, no, actually, just let me have those people in. And they would sit on chairs, they would really engage. Jay's story is a young boy of about 10, and he would come to school, from what I could see, he would come to school, and as long as he just attended for a few minutes, he was then allowed to go and play out on the corridor floor. And that's what he did, that was his education, was just sitting, playing with a toy on the corridor floor. And to me, it was just very reminiscent of, a cat or a dog just sat on the floor. And as I say, he was one who was excluded, and I invited him in, and he sat, and he paid attention, and he engaged. So that had a very strong impact on me. And then when I had the opportunity to do the research, I was really, really interested to look at what might be going on. So I wanted to know, how do pupils who attend, I then decided, because this child was potentially going to be an excluded child, I thought, it does work for these children. So I wanted to go to a pupil referral unit where there was this group of children and find out how therapeutic storytelling worked for them. And what I wanted to know was, is it the story, is it the story content? And I think that's part of it. Or is it the relationship? Is it the storyteller communicating something? And that's what I'm still looking at. And I imagine it's both. So the research is being conducted at 2 pupil referral units in Manchester. There's 6 pupils in a small contained group who are aged 10 to 11, and there's 12 pupils who are aged 12 to 14 in another pupil referral unit. And they come and go, and that's to do with the structure of the pupil referral units. Trying to do research in these units is very difficult, and you just have to go with the flow of whatever you can do there. So I've written down here an example of a storytelling programme. They tend to start school at about 10 o'clock. By the time they get in, they tend to come from more chaotic home lives, and by the time they're settled into school and they're given breakfast and things like that, start about 10 o'clock. So if it's the first few times I've met them, we might do some introduction games, getting to know you games, things that use literacy and things like that, alliteration about your name and things. And of course we do ground rules and things. But generally the pupil referral units already have more stringent ground rules than I would want, because I want them to feel comfortable to express themselves in lots of ways, and I feel confident that I can contain them. And there has to be some negotiation with the staff that is going to be acceptable and they are comfortable with that. And sometimes it's a matter of choosing particular staff who are comfortable with that. And I think that's very, very important for this type of research. Not necessarily so important for storytelling, using stories, but for this type, I think it is very important. So then I might start off with a pre-story introduction. So I've given an example here of Stone Soup. Stone Soup's a story that's around, it's in the children's books being published and things like that. So I'll just put that one down. I won't go into it because there's no need. But in the end, the whole community, some travellers are hungry and the doors are all shut to them. But in the end, it's the young people in the community that say, hey, come on, let's make some soup for these. Well, the travellers make it themselves with the help of the facilitator grandchildren. And so there it's about this communal meal that's going to be shared to everybody. So I might talk about, because I'm very interested in the development of self, and I think it's very important for the children, the young people, to be looking at themselves and trying to get a sense of who they are. So I might use this as an example or as an opportunity for them to think about, if you were a recipe, what would you be? If you were a meal, what would you be? And that might, sometimes they just can't really think in those terms. And it might just be simply starting off with what's your favourite food, what's your favourite meal, and getting them to be descriptive about those kind of things, and trying to then expand their imagination after that. So then tell the story, and then after that, there might be some exercises around that, about who did you identify most with? Did you identify most with the frightened villagers, the curious children, the hungry travellers? What contributions do you feel that you can make to a group? Because this story is all about people having made contributions to this meal. So what contributions do you make? Sometimes children can't, these young people can't make positive statements about themselves. So maybe we can look to the wider group to see if they can make positive statements about the young people. That's an example of how stories can be used. I prefer to take a very non-directive approach. And so, as you'll see when I do the experiential part shortly, I will tell you a story and then give you some suggestions and leave it up to you what you choose to do. And then I will come round and facilitate, maybe make more suggestions as you're working, rather than have a whole group activity. I think sometimes you can do that, but particularly with the young people in pupil referral units, I prefer to let them find their own way of processing the story, and to try and do it in a non-direct way. So we might not even specifically talk about the story, and maybe the processing is going on in what I now understand is this right brain contextual processing, as opposed to this linear, logical thinking about the text of the story, the content of the story, that it's more about just a sense of what they got from the story, and a whole variety of things, which also goes with the heuristics methodology, which I'll come into there in a minute. Buckley, Holt and Whelan, this isn't heavy on references at all, but Buckley, Holt and Whelan note that young people, especially those who are excluded, like the opportunity to talk, but within an environment of normal activities. So trying to keep things as normal, keep the creative process as normal, but just stretch them that little bit, but keep them in their comfort zone is quite important, and then allowing them to talk when they want to talk. Okay, so reflection. So I think this is a really, really important part of it. So while they're engaging in whatever activity they've chosen to engage in, to process the story however they want, I recommend that we engage in reflection. So rather than being too intrusive and asking too many questions or projecting our own ideas into what it is that they're doing, we try to simply see what it is they're doing and reflect back what we've seen. And I thought John Potter gave a really good example when he was talking about that slide with the children who had the mural behind him and everything. I don't know how it was for everybody, but he then gave a layer of meaning that we would have been wrong if we tried to work out that meaning for ourselves. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to just try and stay with the child and mirror what's going on with them. And also with the story selection, I would try to, if I can on the day, come up with a story that I feel is feeding off them and bring a story to them. If not, I'll make a note and try and bring that story back if I feel there's a certain story that would be good to be told. And as I say, reflection is thought to be the very process that goes on with the primary caregiver when we're growing up. And it's that the primary caregiver, the parent, who reflects back how we're feeling and holds how we're feeling, the emotional, the tantrums and all of that. And it's the parent who says that if that's okay, you know, and offers that calmness that allows the child to take back that emotion and handle that emotion and be comfortable with that emotion and understand that emotion. Does that make sense? Okay, so this research was guided by heuristic methodologies described by Mustakas. So all the participants will be asked to provide data in whatever form that suits them. So I've put down here poem, story, metaphor. It was recommended, again, John Potter was talking about the agency of the researcher, and of course my supervisor recommended that we went with text. And I won't be doing that in the end because the young people I'm working with are producing text. Ideally, if I had greater resources and greater agency within the crew, they are very supportive, but ideally if I had greater agency, I would be allowing them to express themselves in terms of musical form or drama or however they wanted to. And at this stage, I'm not stopping them anyway. I'm just not necessarily facilitating those opportunities, those expressions. And then the idea is that you present back the data as a creative synthesis. I'll come on to this now. So, just very briefly, I'll go through heuristics. Just check the time, could I see that? No. Okay, very quickly then. So, there's an initial engagement. The idea is, Mustafa says that this is something that's like a burning question that's been around for you for a long time, a conscious or unconscious preoccupation. The research question will have some significant personal and wider social meaning for the researcher. So that's the initial engagement. And then you've got immersion, where you're living the question. It's everywhere. You see it in films, you see it when you go to the supermarket, it's everywhere. Something is jumping out at you all the time. Then there's incubation, so that you've done your research and then you separate yourself from it. You've done the data collection, you separate yourself from it. And this is the idea that, so consciously you're no longer focusing, but unconscious processing is going on. And it's that idea that the eureka moment when Archimedes gets into the bath, so he's no longer focusing on his project, his research anymore, and he gets into the bath and all of a sudden the answer comes for him. to him, or the idea that, you know, you're looking for something and people say, oh, if you stop looking for it, you'll find it. So it's that idea, once you take your conscious mind away from it, the unconscious processing will reveal it to you. And that's the illumination stage, when these other bits start to be revealed to you. New information, corrections, distortions. Your defences, you've taken a step back from it, so your defences aren't up quite so much, and you can afford to see new aspects of it. And then you've got explication, which is a return to the conscious focusing and pulling together the key themes. And then at the end, you would create a creative synthesis. Since my research is about storytelling, the idea is that potentially I'm going to create a story that is an individual depiction about everybody's experience. So the data will be what every individual says about how they have experienced the storytelling program and what has made sense for them, what has worked for them. And then I will bring it together as a whole to create some kind of a story. And also data will also be my own reflective notes. So at the moment I'm in the middle of my research, doing the storytelling program, halfway through, and I'm keeping my own reflective notes about the process that I see occurs. I'm not collecting data directly from the young people at the moment, just my own reflective notes about what I see they are creating and what they're saying. And only at the very end will I ask them to give me their response. Okay, I'll whiz through that because I can see it's nearly past and I'm sure it's very probably useful. As I alluded to before, institutional dynamics, I found that, you know, the staff wanted to manage the children, so much so that they were jumping on them. They are staffed one-to-one, basically, although it might be a group of 3 or 6. In the younger 10-year-olds, it's 6 in the group. The older ones are 3. And there's as many staff as there are children, and they are ready to pounce on them the moment they do anything that they deem to be out of order. And I had to work a bit to get them to step back from that. And luckily, initially with one group, anything that went wrong, they would say, you know, what are you doing here, you know. But actually, I would then say, well, actually, you were already saying that today was going to be a difficult day because they were already off the wall or not on their medication. Not that I agree with the medication idea anyway, but they were already saying that there was all these problems anyway. And I said, actually, what I was doing wasn't leaving them less contained. But those kind of conversations did need to be held. And then the interpersonal dynamics. Counter-transference. This would be about how you feel that sometimes you can go and you can do a session with these children and you can come away and you can feel kind of hopeless and helpless. And the idea in psychotherapy, psychological terms, is that's something that you're picking up from them. And also the institution, these pupil referral units, the children get, or young people get sent to the pupil referral units, and the staff are saying, what on earth can we do with these young people? And then you're going in with this idea that this is what we can do with them, but then some days you can come away feeling quite hopeless. But if you look at it, you can see that good things were happening, but I think it's something about just the general atmosphere, the general hopelessness and helplessness of being in this kind of position in society. Improvement isn't slow, and it's not necessarily incremental. And if we've got time, I'll tell you a little story at the end, which I think sums up the results, the idea about results. And this is just an acknowledgement of the approach avoidance, the disorganised attachment styles, the complex issues that come with the people that you're working with here. And so sometimes there's lots of good stuff going on, but it's not always very evident. They might not want to engage in the task at all, but they might want to sit next to you. Or they might say, I hate stories, it's stupid. And then one day you go in and you don't tell a story at the beginning, and they'll go, the same one will go, are you going to tell a story today? Are you going to tell a story today? You know, that kind of thing. So it's not easy to get a sense of what's going on, because it's, you know, everyone's nodding, so you all know what I mean. One of the creative things that I invite them to do, and they can do whatever they want, is to give them a shoebox, a kind of memory box, as John was referring to before, to try and get them to develop a sense of self, to put things in it, to create things around it, and it also is symbolic, it's containment, it's a holding of them, of their selves. And this young lad here, he put all the things on the outside of his box. It was his first day in the pupil referral unit, and he was really, really scared. So we kept things very, very simple. What's your favourite food? What football team do you like? Those kind of things. So we stuck that all on the outside. And then one of the teaching assistants printed off, I asked for some emotional expressions of emotional states. And we got loads of these, what do you call them? Emoticons, that's it. Loads and loads and loads of them. So it wasn't really a great variety. It was just loads of these kind of different things. But anyway, they used them well. But this young lad stuck in his empty box one that was just basically like this. So all the outside was quite sanitised and quite nice. But inside, when the teachers, and of course the teachers have all sort of had great fun looking at the boxes and saying, oh, whose is this, whose is this? And of course, when the teachers will have lifted up his box lid, that's what will have come staring at him. Out there. T's story. He's a young lad who apparently is off the walls in all the other sessions. Very chaotic home life currently. Well, in the long term, but particularly exacerbated at the moment. And what he's chosen to do with his box is to create a really lovely home. It's you know, it's one of these, I live in a messy home. What's the opposite to a messy home? You know, the clean line living, flat screen on the TV, and it's all very neat, and it's just wonderful. And on the top of it, he's stuck 2 characters who apparently live in this home. And the teacher, you know, the teacher that I work with is just amazed to see how and all he does is just, he gets, and he'll listen. And sometimes if the others are disturbing the story, he'll say, just be quiet, or whatever he says in his, you know, and asks them to be quiet. But otherwise you wouldn't really know that he's particularly listening to the story. He's just engaged in his box. And when they have to swap over, he'll ask if he can stay later and through the next session to continue as well. This guy, Ben, he doesn't particularly do much. He's decorated a box. He doesn't particularly do much, but he sits and he asks for a story, and he says he's also another one of these. So out of all these pupil referral unit young people, these people who I'm actually talking about are the most difficult to handle, and they are all displaying positive interaction, positive engagement with stories. And he sits with his head down on the desk, and he'll jump ahead with the stories, and he'll tell me what he thinks is going to happen. And so I encourage him, and we augment the story together. B, she is somebody who gets very angry and agitated. She stomps around, and then I told a story that was an Irish folklore story, the equivalent of our Arthurian legends, Fionn McCool. And so it's magical. He's got magical powers. And the others are all debating magic or don't believe in magic. So of course, part of what I'm trying to do is ask them to begin to use their imagination and play with the idea that magic might exist, and just open up there, expand their minds a bit. And she turned around and went, shut up, I believe. Which is really quite interesting. And she's another one who, I don't want to, it's the storyteller, which I get called. And then one day when I was a bit slow to tell a story, she asked for a story. And she's also one of the ones who comes and just sits. Doesn't particularly, in fact, one of her assistant, the teaching assistant who works with her, has created her box. Much to my frustration, I tried to ask the teacher's assistant not to create the box, but that's what I think it is the teaching assistant's own anxiety that she wants to be doing something and seems to be engaging with the young person. But the young person does come to sort of sit with me while I work with somebody else. And then there's this other young. I asked him how should I describe him, and when I came in, he said, "Oh, a lovely young man who." The best man I've ever met. He's a lovely young 13-year-old lad, and he just comes out with such wisdom that he has gleaned from the stories, and he's just like a wise man. And then interestingly, so we all sort of not humour, but engage with him when he tells these things, the wisdom, the stories that he tells. And then he said he can't display this wisdom at home. And as yet, I don't know why that is. I haven't been able to go further. So we've got sh, C, and B. All of these people, this is 2 10-year-olds and a 13-year-old, all of them have used these emoticons to say, this is how I'm feeling. They've just taken them for themselves and just said, this is how I'm feeling. And then we've sat, and there's been an incident that's happened, either they've come in grumpy from school or there's been an incident between 2 pupils. And then I've sat just one-to-one telling them stories. These are all different children, different occasions. And I've just told them stories. They've been up there and ready to get, thrown out of the class. None of them have ever had to leave the class, which in these institutions is quite unusual. But potentially one of them was going to, and I've engaged with them with stories, and they've come right down, and then they've been keen to show me that. So they were expressing real anger, but also pointed. One of them also pointed to this sadness, although you'd never know it. The anger, the aggression that was being expressed, that he felt sad as well. But with the intervention of stories, they all moved towards a happier state and a much calmer state, and they were able to stay in the class, then they get their points, and it just goes on. This one here, you're a nice teacher. I think that's about them expressing this is a really nice experience. One of them, the wise one, says stories are good, they're helpful, you think about things you don't know, and then you go, oh yeah. It's good, they make you laugh. It's all about teamwork. So that's about one of them taking away the messages from the story about teamwork. I don't preach a moral. I don't explain the stories. I let them just engage with it. Sometimes you need help in your life, and not everything has to be perfect. So they're just messages. Right, it's time for the story and then the experiential bit. I don't know whether it helps to leave the story up there. I don't normally have the story up there. What do people want? Not to have the story up there. What can we do? Can we move it on a bit and then? Or switch it off or something? Or
To switch off the screen.
Switch off the screen?
Okay.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. I'm just not okay with it. Okay, so we'll just check where we're at. Okay, so we've got about an hour, so we'll crack on with the experiential bit and then leave. I was going to leave 15 minutes for questions at the end, but people can just ask questions as and when. And so we'll try and use this hour for the experiential part. So I'm going to start off with a story. This is called the cracked pot. There was an old man, and he'd been walking for years, carrying 2 pots on a yoke across his shoulders, and he'd walk down the path to the stream to collect his water, and he'd do this every day, day in, day out. He'd carry these 2 pots. Now, one pot was a perfect pot. A fairly new pot, it was just pristine. It was hung there, and he'd fill it up at the stream, and he'd put it on the yoke, and by the time he got back, that pot was full. But the other pot was cracked, broken, chipped, and it leaked. And he'd go down and he'd fill that one up, and by the time he got back, it lost half of its water. But day in, day out, this old man would take the 2 pots down to the stream and fill them up, put them back on his yoke, and carry them back. Day in, day out, and day in, day out, this nice, pristine, perfect pot would nag, at the cracked pot. You're no good at all. I don't know why he bothers with you. You're cracked, you can't do the job you're supposed to do. You're no good at all, you're useless. The perfect pot would listen to this day in, day out, day in, day out. And in the end, the cracked pot said to the old man, I'm no good, I'm useless, I can't even do the job you want me to do. I spill half my water. You'd be able to bring back much more water if you had a nice, fine, perfect pot. And the old man said, look, and pointed to the path that they walked day in, day out. Look, on the side of the path where the perfect pot is carried, it's dry and stony. Look, on the side of the path where I carry you day in, day out, there are beautiful wild flowers, and those flowers bring such joy and pleasure to my life and to all the villagers all around. Why should I change you for a perfect pot? Now, I'm going to hand out some paper for you to work in pairs, on your own, in groups, or all together, however you want to work this. It's entirely up to you. And I'm going to give you some suggestions. I'm handing out loads of paper, you're not going to get through it all, of course. You don't even, just because I'm giving you paper, you don't even have to interact with the paper. You can do whatever you want. You can sit on the floor if you want. I'll put these about here. But just to give a little bit of structure, I'll invite you to, thank you.
Did you want that back?
That's lovely, thanks. I'll invite you to come up with 10 statements about yourself. This comes from Kuna McPartland, it's very old, 20 self-statements, which is about self-identity, self-esteem. Okay, so if you just come up with 10 self-statements and try and just list them off the top of your head. Oh, you write them down by all means, but try and just, you know, just take a few moments. And if anybody's uncomfortable and doesn't want to partake, you know, that's free. You can just do whatever you want to do at the time. Or leave. That one. Do you need to?
Yeah, of course, I've got everything. Takes your fancy.
Sometimes they say when you do work like this, it's good to, these are all optional ideas of course, it's good to use your opposite hand, so your non-dominant hand. Again, yeah, you don't have to, but the idea being that you're connecting with the right side of the brain. Okay. Well, that is if you're not dominant, if you're left-handed, do it with your other hand, but yeah. Okay. And so that's, that it's a different form of, you're not being so logical, basically. while you're doing that, I'll just make a note that very often children, young people, describe themselves in terms of physical attributes, or eyes, hair colouring. We older ones tend to describe ourselves more in terms of social roles or personal traits. So you might want to look at your list and see how you're describing yourself. Where do I go back? Oh. You've got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you can click on that.
I couldn't see it there.
I know, it's quite, it's
Yeah.
isn't it?
Okay, so how have we all done? Okay, would you like to try describing yourself to art magazine, to street sports, however, or to everybody in the group, however you want to word this? So looking at the things that you've written down about yourself. Introducing yourself to.
I guess I can read them out loud.
Well,
Is that fine?
yeah, or just give a sentence about yourself, so not to necessarily list, but just to, hi, I'm, and just say something about yourself, yeah?
Okay. This will be very okay. Hi, I'm not very talkative with people I don't know very well.
All right, thank
That's
you.
a fact.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Hi. I started off with I'm not left-handed. But you know what, it really worked, the left-handed thing. And by the end, I wouldn't have put that, but I'm like a nester with no nest at the moment because I'm between houses. Nostalgic, philosophical, introspective, and a not-so-secret thumbsucker. That's right, even at the age of 26.
Okay, thank you. You don't have to list them, you can just say something.
Okay, I'm African, female, student, inquisitive, fascinated by the human brain, and averagely a good friend.
Lovely, thank you.
Hi, I love stories, and I'm actually a storyteller myself.
Oh, great. Lovely. Where do you tell stories? Where are you from? Are you?
I'm Norwegian, and I'm educated as storyteller as part of drama and theatre, communication studies. And I write my thesis about stories.
Oh, what's your thesis about?
Storytelling in education, in school. Yeah, so professional storytellers coming to schools with multicultural students.
Lovely, thank you.
The top one is I'm multiple.
You're multiple. Okay.
And I'm also motivated.
Yes.
I had exactly the same experience. So my first four was my right hand and my final four with my left. And it's more a comment than saying who I am, but they're really different. But in my left hand I put I'm in love, I'm decorating a house, and I'm missing being outside. And my first one was I am Charlie.
You were Charlene.
Charlie is my name.
Charlie.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie.
Well, I'll just pick the one that says I miss home food, but I do enjoy desserts here.
Okay. All right. Now, thank you for those. So, if you'd like to now sort of add to your list or take some more papers, and some of you have filled that one already, and say something about 5 things that you're good at, or 5 things that are good about me, 5 things that you're not so happy with, 5 things that you'd like to change. So some of you already gave some perhaps less than positive, made some less than positive statements. So you could sort of think about those ones. You don't have to make new ones, you could just keep those ones. Christina.
Christina, K-R-I-S-T-I-N.
Ah, right. It'll be a terrible video, won't it? Because there'll just be these moments of just quiet and just scribbling.
It can be edited.
Oh, yes, it's true. So for anyone who's finished, we can think about, this is an icebreaker that I do with them. I get the children to come up and write their names up, which they often like to do, because often they're not allowed to do things like that, but I get them to do that. And then we try and do alliteration with the names. So anybody who's finished that exercise can be thinking about how we might alliterate some of these names. So we've got two Nickies, and Kristen, and Charlie, and Charlotte, Mahini, did I spell that right? And Oslan, and Weishin. Okay. Yeah, that's going to be. I think we'll have to exclude Cheeky Charlie because I think that's too obvious, isn't it? And I always encourage them to come up with positive statements. Trying to get them to say something positive, like an affirmation, something positive about themselves. And sometimes they have difficulty at the start, and so we get the group to say positive statements about them. But then eventually trying to get them to own a positive statement about themselves. Two that I tend to get is Nice Nicky and Ninja Nicky. But if anybody can come up with anything more interesting than that would be good. What about you, Charlotte? Can you think of anything for your name?
For myself, I don't know, sharing Charlotte. It was quite
Okay, that sounds good. Oslam?
That will be hard. That will be
That would be hard, yeah. Those,
You could say it in you know, your own language if there's one that works.
maybe.
What about you?
it's cool kids.
Sorry?
It's cool
Yeah, an alliteration, so it starts with the n, the n sound, the n, you know. I don't know, I'm stuck on it. Because I have to do that one all the time. It's a tricky one. What about you, Kirsten?
Kristen.
Am I allowed to use a C if it's pronounced K?
Yes, yes.
Then I would maybe say creative person.
Great, lovely. Raeln?
Idea. I'll say multiple again. Because in fact when I wrote that, I thought, yes, I'm also Mohini and I'm multiple. Because I don't know what it meant, but it's just, when I said, and I had to write 10 statements, I thought, no, I can't write 10 statements, it's too much. But then I thought, no, but I am multiple, so that just contains everything.
Okay. All right, thank you. And Charlie?
I had chatty.
Chatty. Which in this setting would be an okay thing. Yeah, in a pro it might not be approved of. And Wei-Shin?
Well, I had wishy-washy.
Wishy-washy. Coming from you, I think I'll let you have that one. No. Wizard. Oh, wishy-washy. Nikki, have you come up with anything more? Nurturing, Nikki. Lovely. Oh, that's lovely. Okay, so that's everybody done. Great. So how are we with that then? So you've got 5 things that are good about you and 5 things you'd like to change. So now, if you know, I wouldn't be so explicit about it, but obviously the crackpot story. So we want to reframe the negative statements into something more positive. And this time, if you take a piece of paper and create something. And I've just written down a whole load of ideas. So if I was doing this in the pupil referral unit, I would just maybe start off with a suggestion. But generally what it would be, I would just come around and see what people are doing and see what you were doing and say, oh, you know, how about this? Or, you know, and make suggestions individually depending on where they were taking it. But here I've written down, depending on what you've written, I have no idea. Maybe you want to write a letter of compassion about yourself. You know, about that aspect of yourself that you're not so comfortable with. So that makes sense to everybody. Maybe you'd like to give yourself a prize or an award. So this is looking at the statements that you're not so comfortable with. We want to turn them into something positive. So I can be quite angry. Well, anger is a passionate emotion, and if I flick to this one, so I can be volcanic. But volcanoes have, you know, fertile soils, and I like to think of myself as a big, strong tree that bears fruit that other people can take and nurture with it from. So that's trying to think of it instead of getting stuck in this idea about me just being an angry person, which I'm not an angry person all the time. You know, there's so many other aspects, but it's taking that bit that I can get stuck on and trying to reframe it more positively. So you could make a tree of yourself. You could talk about what's the roots of you, what the trunk is like. You know, something like this, or strong. The branches, the blossom, the fruits, the seeds. You could make a wish. You could do a personal crest, you know, like the, badges and the emblems and stuff. A recipe or a cocktail. So if you imagine something fiery and spicy, you wouldn't want loads of that. Again, going back to something, an emotion like the anger or something, you wouldn't want loads of that because that would be too much. But in small doses with other things, then it adds together to create something nice. The snake of life. The things that you've had to endure in life or take on, the sweet things but also the bad things that you've experienced in life, and how that might have coloured or changed the shape of you. An animal collage, so an aspect that you're quite comfortable with, or the two aspects of the one that you're, the negative aspect, and then the positive reframing of that, and make that into an animal that comes together. Or you could make a story, or anything you want to do. But if you want to do a story, here's an idea that you look at the who and the where, the mission or problem that you've got to solve. There's usually somebody who comes along and helps. The obstacle, and then the solution and resolution. So, but, you know, feel free to just take a piece of paper or other thing and just create something that sees yourself in a positive way. So here I've just got strengths, needs, wishes, absurdities. You know, sometimes I like to tell stories about just how absurd we can be when we get things wrong and learn to laugh at ourselves, because that's something that we don't always do very much, or of course talk about the things that terrorise us, things we're scared of, dreams, passions. I'm like the guy downstairs. When I did this at home, all the words fitted on in their little boxes, but I thought they were on to.
See, I just got to a set and I thought, oh, that's a clever way to write absurdities where it's broken up.
Right.
I hadn't seen the other ones.
And I guess I feel kind of sort of like sensitive about this bit, but ideally I'd like to come around and engage with you all while you're doing it, but then, you know, if any of you feel that you're doing something private and you don't want me to, then that's fine.
How do you find it when do the children start, like when you're working in the referral units and you go around? How do they react to that engagement? Like if it's something like this and you've asked them to do something that's like can be personal or motor.
Yeah, well I don't tend to ask them, so I might go and sit with them and engage with them. And so right at the start of this storytelling programme, they have their boxes, so you know, we just say, would you like to come to work on your boxes? And then while they're doing things, I might start to talk to them, see what's going on with them, see how they're talking. And then I might have some ideas that I'll make suggestions. Well, if they're a bit stuck, fancy doing, such and such, talking about your wishes, or talk about times when if we've just done a story about anger or something, maybe I might say, can you think of some times when you felt angry? That's a very difficult one though, because of course most of them are in pupil referral units because of angry outbursts, and they don't want to own their anger. Anger's a bad thing. So we try to talk about, the fact that anger is a positive emotion. We all feel angry, but it's what you do as a consequence of the anger, how you handle that anger. But that is a more kind of sort of preachy moralistic one, and I try not to sort of get into that. I try to be more subtle. So I'll just engage with them. I'll just start, sit down with them, and if clearly they're showing that they really don't want to, they're just blanking me or turning their back, then, which rarely happens to me. But if they did, then I will just leave them to it. But sometimes, they might just want to be doing that but not talking to you, but want you there as well.
And how do they react? I mean, do they have privacy with it? Like, do they, because I think sometimes it's different to relate to an adult, but how do they relate to, do they feed off each other? Do they interact with each other? Like, I don't know if I can see what Osman's doing. Do you ever get that they're looking at each other's creations, and how does that work?
Yeah, well, generally they're not expressing things very overtly, so there isn't that kind of confidentiality difficulty, because generally they're expressing themselves in ways that we might read into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I might reflect something to them, but I would be very careful about reflecting something in front of other people. That is one of the difficulties. I have set up to do individual sessions afterwards, so they can come and talk about how they feel, especially if they feel quite emotional after some of the stories. But that doesn't really sort of take very well because you know, a lot of the young people don't really want to go for counselling, so that doesn't work. So I just tend to just do what I can do and keep it within the bound, you know, knowing that there are other people around, and keep the conversation at a level that's, you know, so reflecting what they've already expressed. Oh, he's angry, you know, but not to say, you know, are you feeling angry? You know, something like that.
And then is this something that you've developed yourself, this process of storytelling, or is it something that you're, you know, drawing on from elsewhere? I mean, you mentioned the heuristic element, but in terms of the actual process of using the story, how did that develop?
Well, the way in which I use it is very much my own way. I don't know about the experiences that you have. Here we have very cognitive behavioural approaches in schools. So the school might be about Clammy the clever, I don't know, the crabby crab. And the message is quite explicit. It's metaphorical, but it's there. And the kids, especially the young people, you know, the teenagers, you know, but I found when I started to do, so I came through traditional storytelling, that's how I started. So I've done my psychology and I came through traditional storytelling, and then I went and learned Steiner storytelling. And they're very much about creating stories and doing story medicine. So, you know, you would create a story to give, they've got a problem, so you'd create this kind of story. A bit like the educational psychology kind of thing. And I find that when I try to create stories, no matter how carefully I try to disguise things and be symbolic, when I try to create stories, the kids always knew it was just too explicit, and then they just didn't want to know. And I was always more taken with the whole idea of the traditional storyteller, who isn't coming from some of them do work therapeutically, but generally they're just talking about traditional storytelling, and they're just saying, you know, we give this story as a gift for you to do whatever you want with it, for you to make your own meaning and to process it in your own way. So I've taken that and I use that more therapeutically. So there are people around doing it, but I found my own kind of, it is a kind of package that I put together just from my own experience. The attachment is really important, and the reflective work and not being too intrusive. So it's kind of like maybe around the edges is more my individual approach. And I do think that's the most important thing, is just that reflective bit of leaving it for the person to process unconsciously or consciously, whatever way they want, and for us to be as unobtrusive as possible, for us to never assume. I mean, I've told a story there that, you know, most of us have probably understood that story in a particular way, but it's quite important to leave it for the person to really take of it what they want, and never to say, oh no, it's about this. You know, it's really important for them to just, because I've told stories that I think the message is so clear, and then I'll have adults, I'll have, you know, or children as well, I'll have adults who say, no, it's about this, and you think, well, that as their own projections, you know, and that's important, they're working in their own way. Ah, great. Would you like to share a bit more about your experience?
I think I've been both quite differently from you, and I haven't actually used my storytelling so much in education myself. More observed others. What I have experienced though is when I worked at the institution with those behavioral problems. I often use stories as a bedtime activity, you know, putting the children to bed and they want the story, and it's really helpful to you know, build relationships.
Yeah.
I also had some great experiences about, you know, children, because they heard stories they're so inspired, they want to tell them.
Yeah.
So, for instance, earlier today I listened to a guy talking about young people or children with autism, we had a boy with, which we suspected had, I don't know if you call it Asperger's in English, do you? Yes. So among his problems would be talking or having a coherent talk about something. And we experienced that he had heard one story from me, I think once or twice. And he told the whole story for his mom, and she was crying. So she had never heard her son talking so for such a long period before. So I've had some good, episodes, but not really working that systematic as I understand it.
Yeah.
And my studies now is in a normal school, but with some language problems because of the multicultural students, and they use stories, for instance, for helping the language development.
Yeah, stories are used a lot, aren't they, for literacy and language development, and for self-expression and emotional literacy. There's in this country at least, there's a lot of people, or a fair few people, using them in that way. I think one of my messages is that people, I don't know how you found, but people initially, when you say stories or storytelling, they think it's children, little children. And so to get the message across that actually, you can engage anybody at all ages with stories, and we have done for centuries. And also, from a psychological point of view, even within any adult, but certainly these adolescents, there is a young child in there, and it's that relationship stuff that, to just engage them.
And I very much recognise, what you said about the teachers expecting pupils to not behave, and they have to leave the room and stuff like that, and then you find the ones that with ADHD or whatever being the most the best listeners.
Yes.
The one sitting most.
Oh, that's interesting. You find that too.
Yeah, and also the one you described sitting like this, but then you can retell the whole story afterwards.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, again, coming from a psychological point of view, I think it's because you're offering nurturing, as you said, and you're offering containment or holding. And then, like you said, often they just love the opportunity then to recount either the story back. So if somebody has missed, if they couldn't late in, and I've never struggled to have somebody, they're all putting their hands up, but they want to tell the story to the person who's missed it, or missed it the week before or something. Or just to recount their own anecdotes and things like that. Yeah. And I think that's what's important. So often storytelling is used in that kind of, in mainstream for people to sort of express themselves. But I think the idea that these young people, especially these hard to reach, these troubled young people, could also use that, and they have stories to tell. And it might not be, a very clear linear story about their lives. It might just be something abstract, symbolic, and what have you. They still need that opportunity to express themselves instead of always being told to, manage their emotions all the time. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So how have we got on? Have we got some interesting things that people would like to share? Do anybody do? Oh, we've still got plenty of time. We've got. It's 4:20, is that correct? Yeah. And we finish at 2:45, don't we? So do people have any questions about the research, the methodology, or anything? Yeah?
How would you adapt these to, like in sub-Saharan Africa, you get situations where pupils are afraid of their teachers, like you get threatened with your teachers, like if you're not behaving at home, your parents can tell you, I'll tell it to your teacher, and then you get strict. As in it's that situation, not necessarily because you're being caned or something, but there's just the fear of the teacher. And so you do whatever your teacher tells you, you're at your best behavior in school.
Right.
Yeah, how would you adapt this methodology to that kind of situation?
The research methodology or the story program?
Or the story program, yeah.
Well, I think, if I understand you correctly, there's probably some overlap with some of the children in the pupil referral units in that, although some of them you know, can be off the walls, there is a very strict behavioural management code environment. You know, so they have to behave in a certain way. They don't always do it, but so what I'm thinking is that there is that similarity where they're watching themselves and they're trying to contain themselves. And I think what I tried to do to counteract that was to play games, expressive games, and to be more permissive, and to gradually be more permissive. And I did this with one particular group, and the teacher didn't like it. And the teacher didn't like it for one thing because they were loving the fact that I was coming, and this was going to be great and fun. And so that was challenging his authority, although I was always trying to include him in the games and we were always playing together, but it was a real problem for him. You know, it seemed to be a problem for him. I don't think they ever did sort of become unmanageable, although that's the kind of thing. And so he was kind of talking to me the way he talked to the children about, you know, me having to be more structured and this, and they can't handle it this, you know. And so to be fair with that group, I didn't intentionally leave that group, but I spoke with the head, and they decided that the best way to manage it would be to work with a different group, with a teacher who would have the confidence to be hands-off and be okay with that. So that's gone off at a tangent slightly from what you're saying, but basically by just trying to create a more permissive, more fun atmosphere where there's games about storytelling. So there's lots and lots of, and I mean, you could just Google all sorts of things for storytelling games and things like that, but we would do things like anything from like wink murder, where you're all in a group and one person has committed the crime, and okay, one person goes out of the room. One person goes out of the room, they're the detective, and then the group all stands around, and one person is the murderer, and they have to wink at everybody. And so I might wink and then you die, and then, you know, and the person who comes in has to guess who it is. And that's about facial expressions. I don't like the idea of murder and everything, but it's basically about, you know, facial expressions and, you know, being expressive and things like that. And they loved that. But then you can be, you know, you can do storytelling circles. So if you'd like to start, you know, and just tell a little bit of, I'm not going to ask you, but you could say, you know, tell a little bit of a story that starts off with a teapot, and then you say something, and then I throw in an orange, and then a boat, and then, you know, get to, oh, there's just a whole load of different things like that where they just start to have fun playing with words, playing with being expressive, playing with getting out of their seats or sitting on the floor, all those kind of things that they're just very often they're not allowed to do. So if you were working with a teacher who was very strict, you'd have to gradually take them along with you as well as the pupils. But if you say that you're going into a group and that's just the atmosphere, that's the attitude of the pupils from the start, and you just take those, you know, pupils along with you, gradually becoming, you know, more and more permissive, but within a contained, with ground rules and things like that, and about respect and things like that. So, because sometimes then when you've given them the permission, then it could just sort of overspill, and so you want to have your ground rules as well. Anybody else?
I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on, in terms of your methodology, this heuristic approach, and what actually, I don't know how you would see it, how it works for you then interpreting, if you did end up, I mean, I know you're at this stage of making reflective notes yourself, but if you do end up with you could end up with such a variety, an amazing variety really, of expressions, how you would then analyse that and deal with it and manage it.
Yeah. Well, my supervisor was very keen, who has done heuristic methodology himself, and he was very keen I kept it to text. I'm not really at a stage where I appreciate why he wants it just to be text. I see, what I like about heuristics is it's very, very similar to therapeutic processing anyway. So if I was to engage in a therapeutic session, then we're talking about the language, we're talking about the non-verbal communication, we're talking about, you know, embodied stuff. It may be pictures that they bring, it may be a t-shirt that they wear, there's all sorts of stuff going on. And I'm processing that all the time anyway, in a kind of, effectively in a heuristic kind of way. So at the time I might be engaging and feeding off the verbal stuff and some sense of what I get, but then later if I write up some notes or if I think about it, some things will come to, oh yeah, and there was that, and then there was that, and a bigger, clearer picture comes together anyway. So I think the two processes are very similar. So yeah, in terms of the heuristics, I'm happy to just take it all and I just see it, processing it in a very homogeneous way. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but I wondered then how, and I'm very sympathetic to that approach, and it's something that I immediately have the same inclination towards. But I wondered then how you deal with that process in an academic environment that so likes to attempt to put any prejudices, makes them known, and tries to, I think still, even if we say that we're allowing, accepting these sorts of ways of analysing data, it still, to me, still tries to, I think we still try and put them in a box a lot of the time, and I wonder how you deal with that.
Yeah. Well, I'm very lucky. I did a doctoral thesis, which I didn't complete 15 years ago. The problem I had there was I was doing psychodynamic work, and I was then examined by somebody who was very behavioural, and I just got so frustrated at the changes I had to make. I just thought, forget it. And I had my own family, and I just thought it just wasn't worth this battle. How can I explain something that is so abstract to somebody who wants things so concrete, and it just wasn't. So I just gave up. But we're very, very lucky on our course. It's a professional doctorate in counselling psychology, and we get to choose our examiners. So I can choose people who can appreciate what it is I'm trying to say. So I don't have to, fit boxes. We do a process where we have to present our research proposal for it to be accepted by the examining board, at that initial stage, and then we present to a group of people, about half of the people who we don't know. And our psychology, the counselling psychology, is in the School of Education as well. And so, the panel can be from the School of Education, can be teachers, and not necessarily obey with heuristics, whereas it tends to be in the counselling department that they're more familiar with it. So we had to sort of negotiate and try and speak their language, but and they would be asking questions about the data collection process. But having got through that, I'm now at liberty to sort of.
And they were okay. You weren't this idea that you're, because how do you manage with that? To what extent is it your projection onto the data or onto the research participants? And to what extent is it stuff that they're coming up with?
Yeah. So a very big part of my thesis will be about my stance, so where I'm coming from. So everything about trying to be as transparent as possible about everything that I am bringing to the lens with which I will look at this data. And then also when I get the individual depictions from all of the participants, to reflect back to them. So this is what I understand, and is that, so member checking. And then also trying to, ideally one of the things that they wanted from the School of Education, from one of the teachers, was for me to follow a programme that was very, very strict, so that anybody could replicate it. And at the time I said that that's what I would do. But part of my process is to feed off them and to be collaborative. So I haven't done that, but I can document the stories I tell and the process. so people can replicate it, but it won't be.
It won't be exactly.
No, but then, you know, we need to... So, and it's about multiple truths as well. It's about saying, you know, that this isn't a truth. This is about, you know, an experience, and these were the things that were reported by these people, and this is the sense that I had, and this is what the teacher said, and just to give a picture, a flavour of the experience, rather than it being, you know, a truth.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, yeah. Any other questions?
I just this is so you said that you kind of try to kind of take, I guess, the temperature of the room and react to the students. Is there any time where you feel like you've told a story and it has gone in a way that you really didn't expect, and you've had to bring it back from somewhere difficult?
No, but what comes to mind is a story that I told to the 12, 13-year-olds, and it's about two sheep thieves, and they're caught, and they've been stealing sheep for years, and they're caught and they're branded with ST, sheep thief, on their forehead. And one of them carries on in the same area and continues to steal sheep and is hung for being a sheep thief. And the other one decides to go off somewhere else and goes to a completely new part of the country and enters the village, and nobody knows what's the ST. And they think, oh, it's a saint, so they start to treat him like a saint, and he behaves in that way. You know, he's everything's provided for him, and he's comfortable, and he's generous back, and then he just dies as an old man, and he's got a tombstone that says that he's a saint. And I like that story, and I think it's got a nice message, especially for these kids, about, you know, having opportunities, and you don't have to wear that label. But I don't like the branding. I hate that bit, the idea that somebody would brand somebody, and of course we have done that, but I hate that. And the idea that he was then hung, you know, because you're also saying to these kids who are stuck in sort of, you know, bad behaviour, this is the route you could go down. And so I'm uncomfortable with elements of that story. I live in Cumbria, and so the nearest place, although I've been down to the English Storytelling Society, my nearest port of call is the Scottish Centre for Storytelling, so I go up there for mentoring, and I'm part of a group up there. So I work on things up there, and they do therapeutic storytelling up there as well. And so I worked on this story with them after I told it, and I said I just wasn't happy with it. And, you know, we really explored the fact that it was about my own discomfort with certain aspects of the story. So I think it's important for you to be very comfortable with the story, because otherwise what you know, you're trying to convey all this warmth and holding with your story, but if you're uncomfortable, you're just conveying something negative and uncomfortable. And when I did tell that story, and I felt uncomfortable, one person really got stuck in a whole load of negative stuff. Now that may have been her stuff about how, because she'd done it the week before, and she regularly does do about how people use people and sell people and, you know, kill people. She did just more of the same, but I was just very aware that actually that could have come from my telling of the story, might have conveyed a different message.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would be the one thing, is just to be clear about what it is you want to convey. Not a moral, but just, you know, to be comfortable, and then you're conveying a message in a comfortable way. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any? We've got about 10 minutes for either any questions, or if people want feedback. I'm intrigued. Would you like to share?
Well, I was thinking of the wishy-washiness, so what came to mind was the signpost. So the wishy-washiness helps me to think about where to go. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay.
But it brings me to places, and it connects to places. So, and it brings